Great. Yeah, so my name's Akashamitra, for those of you that I haven't met yet, and I'm going to be talking in the second half. So I know a couple of you are new this evening, and really a special welcome to you. And how we run these evenings is that we do a meditation in the first half, then we have a tea break, and then we give a talk in the second half. So it's talking about a particular theme related to Buddhism. And how we do that is we do it in, what are they called? Series, that's right, we do it in series. So we'll run usually like a 6-week series or something like that, where we take a particular theme or a particular book or a particular teaching, and we talk about that for that period of 6 weeks. And we're starting a new series this evening, and the series is on this book called Who is the Buddha? By Sangharakshita. Who is the Buddha? By Sangharakshita. Just out of interest, who was here last week? It was a very, very packed evening last week. Oh, there's a few of you. Yeah, okay. So last week we were actually celebrating Sangharakshita's birthday. So he died, I think it was 4 years ago, at the age of 93, but it would have been his birthday this week. So a couple of days ago it would have been his birthday. And so he's the author of this book. It's actually pulled together from various talks that he gave. So like a lot of Sangharakshita's work, he didn't actually sit down and write it. I mean, I think there's something like 30-odd books that he wrote. But a lot of them were actually the product of talks that people have transcribed. And this is no different. But what we're doing with this book is really kind of going back to basics. This question of who is the Buddha is a very, very basic one to us as Buddhists. Or if you're interested in Buddhism, that's the question really, isn't it? It's like, well, who is the Buddha? Why would we've got this huge statue of the Buddha here on the shrine. Why would we have a statue of the Buddha there? What's his significance for us? Like, why would we, for example, I remember being on a retreat about 10 years or so ago, maybe a little bit more than that, and somebody saying, like, they don't always relate to Buddha images. They relate to beauty, but they don't always relate to Buddha images. So he was saying, like, I'd be quite happy, for example, if we just had like a Rothko there, for example, a painting by Mark Rothko. And actually, I can sort of see what he is getting at, what we're trying to do with an image like that. Some of you might have shrines at home where you might have flowers on that shrine, or you might have a picture that speaks to you. You might have something that speaks to you of beauty. And what you're trying to do there, often with an image on the shrine, is sort of open your heart, and I can see actually how a Rothko painting would do that. But we have the Buddha there for a reason. And there's this sort of visually poetic evocation of the Buddha. He's golden, he's beautiful, he's sat there very serenely. But why would we have him on the shrine? That's the question, really. And I'm just to completely ruin the whole evening right from the off, I don't think I can actually fully answer that question. But I'm going to say why I can't fully answer that question. And I'm going to sort of do my best, even if I might slightly fail in the attempt. But where I want to start is asking, well, why would we ask the question, who is the Buddha? So you'll notice, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, the book is called Who is the Buddha? Not Who was the Buddha? And that might sound a bit like it's just a word or it's just semantics, but actually that's really important. And I think that is our first sort of clue about who the Buddha actually is. So the answer is slightly in the question. I thought maybe I'd just open that up a little bit. If I ask all of you, who is the Buddha? Or who was the Buddha? Maybe you can just shout out a few things. Just out of interest to start off with, I know some of you are quite new. Who knows a little bit about the Buddha's life story here? Like, who, if I asked you, like, who could sort of reel off some events from them? I'm not going to ask you to do it, by the way. Who's going to ask you to? Yeah, so a few of you could. Yeah, so most of you would say that you know something about the Buddha. So who is the Buddha? Just shout some things out.
Siddhartha Gautama.
Siddhartha Gautama, that's right, yeah. So he was born with that name, wasn't he? So the Buddha is an honorific title. It means one who is awakened. Yeah, that's right. And his birth name was Siddhartha. Somebody said he was a warrior. Yeah, so he was born. Somebody said, was that you, Harry? Yeah. So he was born a warrior. That's right. He was born into the warrior caste. Anything else? Oh, both at once. Stereo sound. Who? That's right. So he's a real person. He was a real human being. And somebody said something else?
He gained enlightenment.
That's right. Yeah. So we've got a few different things there, haven't we? And the ones that I want to sort of draw attention to are people saying things like he was a warrior, he was born Siddhartha Gautama. So he was a real person, as you were saying, Bex. He was a real person. So we can place the Buddha in history. So with some Buddha figures that we look at, they're sort of mythic or semi-mythic figures. If you talk about Buddha figures like Ratnasambhava or Avalokiteshvara, they're not historical figures. They're thoroughly archetypal figures. But with the Buddha, he was actually a real human being. So you could actually place him in history. So historians argue about the details of the Buddha's life. That there's some debate about who exactly he was and the details of his biography, but he was a historical figure. We know that. But we're not as concerned with that. What we're concerned with is what Nadia pointed out, which is that he gained enlightenment. So he's significant for that reason. And that's why we're asking who is the Buddha. So it's what we're asking really is what's his significance for us today? Like, what does the Buddha have to teach us? Why would we be interested in the Buddha? Why are we sat here 2,500 years after his death talking about the Buddha? And the way Bhante sort of puts this in context, the way Sangharakshita puts this in context in the book is that he talks about not being so concerned with history, but being concerned with him as a guide and taking each of the elements in his life as an example that can actually show something about our lives. So at the break, Kusalasara was talking about the Introduction to Buddhism and Meditation course that we've got coming up, which Maitri Kumara is leading. And who here has done that course? Oh, right, okay. Interesting. Okay, yeah, so a couple of you have, but lots of people do that course and then they end up coming to Dharma Night. None of them are here at all tonight, but that's okay. But that's often what happens is people do that course and then they start coming to the regular class, but not on bank holidays. In that course, what we do is we contextualize the Buddha's teaching in his life story, basically. So we talk about key moments from the Buddha's life, and we look at what those actually mean and what the significance are of those for us. And that's really what we're concerned with, is the Buddha as an example. So what he can tell us about his life through the example of his life. And every single thing in the Buddha's life has meaning for us. So it's not like he was a historical figure in the sense that, you might read a biography of, I don't know, someone like Charlie Chaplin or, I don't know, whoever it is. If you're interested in him or you're interested in, I don't know, someone else. My random pop culture generator is not working very well this evening, but so you might be interested in somebody and you might be interested in their life because they're somebody whose life you're interested in, you like their work and that sort of thing. But their life doesn't have a sort of mythic significance for you. It's not like everything Charlie Chaplin did can teach us something about our own life. Whereas with the Buddha, it's different. Every single thing that we know about the Buddha is like an example for us. So I thought I'd just pick out one of them, and just by way of to sort of illustrate that. So some of you will be familiar with an episode from the Buddha's life called the Foresights. Are some of you familiar with that, the Foresights? Yeah. So we know that, or the myth is that the Buddha lived in great wealth. He lived in a palace, and that he left the palace. His father basically didn't want him to become a great spiritual teacher. His father wanted him to become a warrior. So his father kept him enclosed in the palace that he lived in, and he snuck out on several occasions. So the Buddha snuck out beyond the palace walls, and he saw an old person, a sick person, and a dead person on 3 separate trips out. And this really, really shook the Buddha. So the myth is, I mean, I can't imagine that this is actually true, but the myth is that the Buddha had never seen an old person before. Maybe it's true, maybe it isn't. But the point about the myth is that it's designed to tell us something about our own life. You could say he'd never seen an old person, a sick person, or a dead person before, or you could say that it's as if he was seeing those things for the first time. And that really, really shook him to his core. So this was a key turning point in the life of the Buddha, is seeing, in a way, you could say, seeing the difficulty in life, seeing the challenge in life, seeing the painful aspects of life for the first time. So before this, he'd lived in luxury. He'd been surrounded by every kind of luxury he could possibly want. His father was very keen to keep him distracted and keep him enjoying himself. And he saw an old person, a sick person, and a dead person. And that really, really shook him. And he saw like a wandering holy man who seemed to offer him some sort of vision of how things could be different. And the key thing about that is that it's not just that the Buddha saw those things, it's that he then couldn't live his life in the same way afterwards. It's like he wasn't the same person after witnessing those things. So I don't know if any of you can relate to that. The example that I often use is like my father died when I was 24, and that had a very, very strong effect on me. I was very young, it was quite unexpected, and my life was never quite the same after that. It brought things sharply into focus for me. And I was thinking about this today. It's like, when we talk about these things, the foresights, old age, sickness, death, it's very, very tempting to sort of think, okay, well, this is an episode from the Buddha's life, and this happened to the Buddha, and then, the Buddha changed his life on the basis of that, and then, you think of that in terms of the Buddha's biography. But the whole point about it is that it's saying something to you. So it's saying something to each of us. Like, what does that mean to you? What does that say to you? So today, when I was just thinking about what I was going to say this evening, I was thinking about this in relation to, like, at the moment, this morning I had a conversation with a very close friend who, his wife died just a few months ago in February. And they're both very good friends of mine. So I lived with her husband when I was at university, this friend that I was having a conversation with today. And she died very suddenly in February, and she was younger than I am, a couple of years younger than I am. So it was a real shock. And, I've been in touch with him, and today we were just messaging each other, and I was asking him how he was getting on, and I know it's been extremely difficult for him. It's been very, very challenging for him. And he said it's like a merry-go-round, basically. He said it's like a merry-go-round that basically I want to get off, and I just can't get off. And I felt so much sort of sorrow for him today, really, hearing that. It's such a strong metaphor. It's really painful for him. He wasn't expecting that. None of us were expecting her to die. And yet that is what has happened, and this is the situation that he's left with. Also, at the moment, I've got an uncle who has been in a coma for nearly 3 weeks. He had an operation a few weeks ago, and he knew there was quite a risk when he went into the operation. It was a very serious operation, took 10 hours. He knew there was a risk when he was going into it. He's had this operation and then he's gone more or less straight into a coma. He's just starting to come out of the coma now, but we don't know what kind of recovery he's going to make. He's very, very disorientated, can't speak, isn't making any sense, that sort of thing. And the question is, like, we know that there is suffering like that in the world, but how do we live in relation to that? How do we live in the face of loss, of difficulty? Because if there was just that, if that was the message, like just that there is suffering, then, well, I wouldn't be a Buddhist, frankly. The whole point is that what the Buddha is offering us is a different way of relating to those kind of events. What the Buddha's message is like, okay, well, there is suffering, there is death, there is pain, there is loss. How are you going to live in relationship to that? And if you take that seriously, and if you really, really live in the knowledge of that, actually that will change your life. What we tend to do is we don't want to face up to the fact that there is this difficulty and there is this loss. So we're in such a crazy situation in a way, aren't we? It's like there is one thing that we can guarantee in life, only one, and that is that we are going to die, and everyone around us, everyone we know is going to die. And we don't know when that's going to happen. And we know that there's going to be various kinds of loss and difficulty. Now, we know that that is the case, but we don't want to face up to that. So we distract ourselves. We dwell often on the surface of our lives in trivia. And in a way, that's completely understandable, isn't it? It's like, in a way, why would we want to face up to that? But by coming into relationship with those things, that could sound like quite a pessimistic message, but actually it isn't. It's like when we live in the light of that, when we live in the light of impermanence, if we can really take on board the fact that life is short, then the question is, okay, well, what are we going to do with it? How are we actually going to live? And my experience of that is, like I was talking about when my father died, what it did was it brought things sharply into focus for me. It was like, okay, my father was the same age as I am now when he died. And it was, it was quite a shock. He was very young, fairly young. He was under the age of 50. And really coming into relationship with that it was a spur for me. I thought, okay, I can see that life is short and life is precious. Like, we don't know how long we'll have it. So what are you going to do with it? That's the question, really. I remember I was talking about this friend of mine who died recently in February, and I went to her funeral. And it was a really strange day for me because when we all knew each other, when we were very, very close friends, but particularly around in the 1990s, and I lived in Liverpool at the time, and I don't go back to Liverpool very often, so I went up to Liverpool for her funeral, and it was really strange. It was like I lived there for 6 years, and it was such a formative place for me. It was like almost every brick in that city has a significance for me. So going back for her funeral was quite a powerful thing. And then we went to her funeral, and I came out of the crematorium, and this friend of mine who I was talking about, her husband, just looked at me and just burst into tears. And I was speaking to him about it later, and he said, looking at me and looking at, basically how old I am now, just made him realize how long we'd been friends. And it was very, very, very moving. And this is a slight aside, but it's just a nice thing to talk about, really. It was really moving. Like, she was part of a women's cycling team, and this cycling team all cycled in their kind of cycling uniforms into the crematorium in formation, which was really lovely. And it was a really lovely service. And then we all went to the pub afterwards, and everyone was just talking about their job and like, like, oh, what are you up to these days? Oh, I'm in web design, or I'm doing this and this, and oh yeah, right, what are you doing? I'm working for this company, and oh, they're a nightmare, aren't they? And da da da. And I just felt like going like, for goodness sake, like, please, what is going on here? If we cannot acknowledge what has happened, can we at least talk about this person? Can we at least not share memories and share stories and so on? And this is what I'm talking about, is like, in the face of something so profound, we immediately just switch back and we go to trivia. I actually did find out subsequently that it did get to the stage of swapping stories, but it was about 10 pints down the line. And I don't drink, so I just couldn't stand it. I had to leave after about an hour or so, and I sort of left everyone to it. And then the more they started drinking, the more the stories came out and so on, which in a way, maybe that's something. But it's, like, what are we going to do? How are we going to live meaningfully? That's the question. So I thought I would just read you something at this point. We're born into this situation, aren't we? This is what Bhante talks about in the chapter. He's saying, like, how do we start to make sense of our lives? It's a bit like Kuslasara was saying in the first half of the evening. Like, where do we get our information on how to live? We might pick up bits from here and there. We pick up bits from our parents and friends and so on. Because we're in this really strange situation, aren't we? Like, we find ourselves alive. We don't know how we got here. I don't know if you had the same experience as me, but when I was growing up, I had quite a nice family, but I also sometimes thought, like, what am I doing in this family? Like, how have I been born into this group of people? And what's this about? What's that about? And so on. And Bhante puts it very well, so I'm just going to read a little bit from him. He says, it's as if you woke up one day and you find yourself in a strange bed in some kind of inn. You don't know how you got there, and you don't know where you are, except that it's somehow a temporary place to stay, with people coming and going. All you know is that it's not your own place, and you don't recognize the road it's on. You've just woken up, and you're bewildered and confused and wondering what's going on. This is surely more or less how we feel about finding ourselves in the world at all. Here we are with a body, 2 eyes, 2 ears, a mouth, a nose, thoughts, dropped off in the middle of England or wherever, dumped down in the tail end of the 20th century. Old book. What brought us here, we just don't know. We just wake up and here we are. So this is the situation that we find ourselves in, isn't it? We don't, we're not born with a manual, are we? It's not like we wake up, and we get to 13 or 14 or whatever, and somebody goes, well done, you've made it this far. Like, here's the instruction booklet from here on in. We don't have that. And Bhante talks in the chapter about over the evolution of time, people slowly making sense of their lives. Like, people were many millennia ago, people born into this strange world where they don't understand things like the weather and why the sun rises and why some months are hot in the year and some months are cold in the year, and then people learn how to make fire and so on. And now in our sort of modern age, there's lots and lots of competing theories about describing what life is, but they don't all seem to quite join up. So what we're sort of looking for is a kind of a coherent system, really, that will actually get us somewhere. Because the question to ask really is like, where do our beliefs sort of lead us? Because we all have some sort of belief, we all have some belief system, whether we know it or not. We'll have certain beliefs things that we believe about the world that are true. But where do those things take us? I think that's the question, really. Yeah. Okay, so maybe I'll just pause there and see if there's any questions or comments on anything I've said so far. Silence. Okay, is this all making sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So in the chapter, Bhante makes this point, which I think is a very good one, which we often say on introductory courses, is like the Buddha didn't sit down and invent Buddhism. So what he offers us is a very all-encompassing sort of way of looking at reality and how the world works, and principally how our mind works. That's the really important thing. Is our experience is entirely comes to us through our mind, through consciousness, and how does that actually work? So, that's what he offers us. But he didn't sit down and sort of invent Buddhism. So it's not like he sort of had this experience of enlightenment and then sat down and thought, what am I going to do? Because I've left the palace and I'm a bit broke. I've been wandering for 6 years. I know, I'll sit down and I'll invent a religion. Which some people do, don't they? I mean, I think L. Ron Hubbard did that with Scientology, didn't he? No, he actually did do that. I'm not joking. Like, he actually sat down and invented a religion. It was funny because I was walking past on Tottenham Court Road on Saturday. I was walking past the one of the shops, and it said, I can't remember, it said something about the human mind, and I thought it really looked like something that was lifted from the Dhammapada, which is a Buddhist text. So I wonder if he just sort of took the best bits of religions and science fiction, all that sort of thing. Anyway, let's not worry about that too much. But the Buddha didn't invent Buddhism. Basically, what he did was he'd had this fundamental experience. I mean, I don't know if you can actually even call it an experience, but the Buddha's consciousness fundamentally changed at a certain point, and he became what we call enlightened. So he had a completely different view of the world, a completely spacious, crystal clear view on how things actually are, and he spent the rest of his life teaching and communicating that to people. But he wasn't inventing a set of concepts. He was describing how things actually are. People would come to him and say, look, I'm experiencing this difficulty, or I don't understand what's going on with X or Y. And he would have this really, really wonderful, very, very skillful way of teaching where he would relate their experience. So, for example, a cowherd would come to him and the Buddha would find some way of talking to him where he'd say, well, it's like with your cows, Imagine a cow with a great big udder, and the universe is like a great big udder or something. He didn't ever say that. But, it's like he would always find a way of like there's one teaching where he was talking to a musician about effort in meditation, and saying it's like the strings of your lute. They need to be not too taut and not too loose, and so on. But he was pointing out how things are in order to help people to grow and help people to move towards where the Buddha was. And this was his teaching, is that anyone, if they make the right effort, can actually move towards enlightenment. That enlightenment was not the possession of the Buddha. All of us have this potential for Buddhahood. We all have this potential for a mind that is completely clear, that is unmediated by our own views, that can see things absolutely as they are and let go of all the difficulties that we have, move beyond this ordinary suffering that we have. That was his message, that any of us can do that. And the way he described the universe was through the way the universe works is through the teaching of conditionality. So who is familiar with that term? If I say conditionality or praticca samutpada, just put your hands up if you are. Okay, so a few of you are and a few of you aren't. So this is like the concept that underpins all of Buddhist teaching. And I'm going to try and summarize it in about 5 minutes. But anyway, let's see how we get on. Thank you. So the Buddha talks about the processes in the universe not being random, basically. That every condition has a cause. And the universe is a sort of a matrix of causes and conditions. So everything is affecting everything else all of the time. And that includes us. So everything we do and think and say has an effect. It has an effect on our own mind, and it has an effect on the environment around us, and it has an effect on the people around us. And primarily this is what the Buddha was concerned with. So he wasn't into cosmology, the Buddha. He was primarily concerned with relieving human suffering. And in terms of our mind, this conditionality that we're talking about has two principal ways of operating. So it has a cyclical way of operating and what we call a spiral way of operating. And Bhante, I'm going to slightly jump off here and start talking about another teaching of Bhante's, which is from this really wonderful essay called Mind Reactive and Creative, which some of you might be familiar with. This is out of print now, but if you ever see a copy of it, do snap it up, because it's a really, really wonderful essay. And Bhante talks about the cyclical and spiral modes as reactive and creative modes. So there's a kind of a cyclical mode of conditionality, and what that means is that we're actually not really aware at all. We're just responding to stimuli all the time. So this is how most of us are most of the time, is there's a stimulus and then we respond to it. So, for example, we see an advert and we make a plan to buy the thing, or we experience craving, or we feel stressed, for example, and we go to our usual ways of coping with that stress. So we eat, or we go on the internet, or we do something that's unhelpful for us. It's a sort of mechanical way of being, basically, and it's reactive, basically. So we're not really responding with any degree of awareness. So that's the primary thing about this kind of cyclical mode of conditionality, is that we're unaware. And the opposite of that is when there is some awareness present, and it's not dependent on stimuli. So when through, for example, meditation or cultivating awareness outside of meditation, and you all know this, but I'm going to say it anyway, that's the point of meditation, is not to have a good meditation, but to train our minds so that outside of meditation we can be more aware of what we're doing and thinking and saying and how we behave. And as we develop more awareness, we can decide consciously how we want to be in the world. What effect do we want to have on the world? And we notice the effect that stimuli have on us, and we decide actually how we're going to respond. We decide, we might decide to respond more creatively, with more kindness, with more awareness. And the more we respond with awareness, the more that gives rise to more and more awareness. And over time, what that means is we can choose how we are in the world more and more. It's an actual choice. It's not like we're a slave to our desires or just to how we, the sort of the usual stimuli that sort of bears down on us. And the key to that is awareness, basically. So in the text, Bhante talks about the language of evolution, which I'm not going to kind of go into that too much, but really what he's saying is that somehow human beings have evolved to a point where they have this sort of self-reflexive consciousness. So we seem to be the only creatures that actually have that self-awareness. Human beings are aware that they are aware. So, a lion doesn't think, okay, am I going to hunt for my prey? It doesn't sit there one day and think, actually, am I hungry? Or would I be better off as a vegetarian or something like that? It doesn't do that. It just thinks, it doesn't really think in that way. It's just purely led by, instinct and sort of the stimulus of hunger. So it hunts. Human beings have the choice not to do that. And the more we cultivate awareness, then the more we're able to actually choose how we act. So I'll leave aside the sort of the biology and the science of it. Like, it's not, who knows how we actually got to that point, but the fact that we have got to that point means that there's a kind of a jumping off point there, which Bhante calls the higher evolution. And what that means is, we've evolved to a point where we have this self-reflexive consciousness, and that's something we've done as a species. It's not something we've chosen to do. That's not something we choose to do individually. But because we have that self-reflexive consciousness, we can choose, and it's a choice that we do make individually, we can choose to cultivate more awareness. And that's what leads us from here to there, basically, to Buddhahood, is this kind of spiral mode of conditionality where we're choosing more and more awareness. And it's not like we're just an ordinary sort of unaware human being, and then, we practice, and then at a certain point, like, pop, and we gain enlightenment. On the road to that is more clarity, more compassion, an easier way of being in the world, an easier way of sort of managing our lives. And as we learn to have more and more perspective and more awareness, then that makes everything much easier for us. It makes us, it means that we can be much more fluent with life. And then at a certain point, there's so much awareness, there's more and more awareness that our consciousness completely changes, basically, and we approach the consciousness of the Buddha. But the thing with this kind of conditionality is, with awareness, what it means is that we're also less and less dependent for certain conditions for our happiness. So when there's no awareness there, we're completely at the mercy of conditions. So say, for example, things go well for us for a while. We get the job we want, we get the partner we want, I don't know, whatever you think is going to make you happy. You get the lucky break. For me, it would be like, I don't know, I find that vintage Bollywood record that I've been looking for a really good price in a second-hand record shop, something like that. Whatever it is, these little small things and these little big things will sort of either make you happy, in inverted commas, or not. But your happiness and your enjoyment depends solely on those conditions being present. And when those conditions cease, because they will cease, then any enjoyment that you might have or any happiness that you might have comes to an end, because those conditions aren't present anymore. Which kind of takes me back to what I was talking about earlier, around death and impermanence and loss. For a Buddha, he's completely gone beyond that. He doesn't depend on external conditions at all for his happiness, for her happiness. Can you imagine what that's like? That it doesn't matter what is happening to you. It's inconsequential in terms of your mental states. So a Buddha would always be radiant, compassionate, joyful in a way that we cannot even imagine from where we are. And it's nothing to do with what they are experiencing. So there will be certain things that would make a Buddha happy, for example. Like I can imagine a Buddha being happy at the growth of a spiritual community or whatever it is. And it's not that a Buddha wouldn't experience physical pain. So it's said that at the end of the Buddha's life, he was in a lot of physical pain. And he was walking around giving teachings, and he said that his body was like like an old cart held together with straps. So he still experiences physical pain because he's a human being, but his relationship to that pain would be completely different from ours. And the main thing would be that there would be no story about it. So we can't quite imagine that, can we? Because for us, for me anyway, less so as I practice over the years, but like our mind, we experience the world through our mind, and it feels to me a lot of the time like my mind is a filter that's got a lot of rubbish in it. Like something happens to me, I'm walking down the street and I'm like, it's just this running commentary, isn't it? Like, oh, look at them, they look a bit rough, or oh, I don't like the look of them very much. I wonder what's for dinner. Oh, this is good. It's going to be great next week when I do such and such, but I'm not looking forward to what's happening tomorrow. What is happening tomorrow? That's probably just me, isn't it? All of you have this sort of like crystal clear kind of, So for the Buddha, it's not like that at all. And, if somebody comes up and sort of like shouts at the Buddha or something like that, there's no getting worked up about it. There's no like, how dare they? I'm so annoyed. Why does this always happen to me? Life's so awful. Oh, if only I'd gone to university. Oh, if only I'd taken that job, blah, 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 whatever it is. There's none of that at all. And in the absence of that is just this beautiful, open, kind of radiant space. So for a Buddha, I don't know, what's the worst thing you could imagine? Like, he or she could be stood up to their waist in manure, like listening to, like, what's the worst music you can think of? Like Britney Spears sped up or something like that for hours and hours, and still would just experience this spaciousness and this beauty, and, like completely not dependent on external circumstances for their happiness. It's hard for us to conceive of that, isn't it? But I don't know, my experience is that after many, many years of practicing meditation, I can have a slight glimpse of what that might be like. And from where I am, it's just having a bit more perspective. It's like, okay, there is still difficulty, there is still suffering, but there is a little bit more perspective. And sometimes there's a lot more perspective. And that's through practicing what the Buddha teaches. And that's what the Buddha taught is, if you practice what I talk about, you meditate, you cultivate awareness, you behave in such a way that you're being kinder, that you're being more open, you're being more generous, there will be that more of a perspective. There will be, a little bit more of a kind of an ease in life. And that doesn't mean that you won't suffer, but your relationship with that suffering will begin to change. And the key to that, I say this over and over and over again, but the key to that is this self-awareness, is awareness, basically. So this is why we place such an emphasis on this in meditation, the mindfulness of breathing, the metta bhavana. The mindfulness of breathing is pretty obvious that that's about cultivating awareness, isn't it? But it's true in the metta bhavana as well. It's lovely doing that practice just before the break. We're being aware of other people, and we're being aware of our response to other people. Our world is made up of other people and other beings and other creatures. How do we want to be? How do we want to respond? Can we be different? Can we start to change our relationship to others? Okay. So maybe I'll just pause there again. You might not have any questions, but I think it's good just to see if there are any. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. This is something I've been thinking about for a long time, and I'm going to try and formulate it so it sort of makes sense. I guess when I think about enlightenment, not that I have any idea of what it would be, but this idea of like seeing through the kind of the falsehood of reality, that you no longer see the subject-object duality and like whatever else, everything else. Like that feels so alien.
Yeah.
And it's almost like seeing the fourth dimension or something. How would he have known that that existed? And so when he was like, okay, I'm going to sit under the Bodhi tree for, however long until I gain enlightenment, like how would he have known that that existed, and how would he have known that that was the method to attain enlightenment?
Yeah.
But I think something that you said earlier kind of maybe clear something up for me, but I don't know if I've understood properly, about it being about kind of like moving more and more towards clarity, rather than, and there's just this kind of like slow approximation, and I guess maybe through like insights that he had already had through meditation, this understanding that more would come from that. I still just struggle with like how would he have known that there was some kind of climax of knowing? Yeah.
That's a good question. So just for our online viewers, the question is around like how would the Buddha have known that he was going in the right direction? How would he have known that enlightenment was possible? So it's a good question. In the life story of the Buddha, he did make several kind of what could be described as wrong turns. So he had teachers, and they taught him to meditate, and the meditations that he did, he could see there was still suffering in his experience, even practicing those meditations. But it depends which way you read the story. Sometimes I've talked about it in terms of sort of needing to make wrong turns in order to get closer, even though it wasn't quite it. But the Buddha had a sort of an intimation at a certain point when he realized, he'd been practicing austerities, so he'd been starving himself and punishing his body for a long time, and he realized that that wasn't it. And he actually realized that he was going to die if he carried on the way he was. And he seems to have had a moment of insight at that point when he remembered meditating under a tree when he was a child, and it seemed somehow to point to a middle way between sort of austerity and the kind of meditation that he was doing before. So it seemed like he had a sort of an intuitive insight, basically, that he knew that something else was possible, and he sort of followed that path. But I think, that's an important question, but the question is also for us, sort of how do we know that something else is possible? And I think it's important for us to draw on our own experience, and also we need teachers, so we need people that are a bit further down the path than we are, and I think that's sort of really important. So we need somebody, in a sense, who is a few steps ahead of us. There's the example of the Buddha, but in a way, if we met a Buddha, we might not even necessarily be able to relate to his experience because it's so far ahead from where we are. But if we've got people who are a little bit further down the path than we are, we can look at them and, like when I first started coming here, for example, I met teachers that I really look up to that seemed to just have made progress in a way that was relatable to me, and yet was way further ahead than where I am. And I still have, I have lots of people now that I look up to that I feel that way about. So it's like we've got the example of the Buddha, who very clearly said, look, enlightenment is possible. But I think we also need people in our lives who can sort of, from a few steps ahead of us, can also sort of light up that pathway, so to speak. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay, so I'm going to start to wrap up in a minute, but so just very quickly, one thing I wanted to say is like the title of the book is Who is the Buddha? And we were talking at the start about why that's important and why this question is important. And I think it's also important to say who the Buddha isn't. So who is the Buddha and who isn't the Buddha? So the Buddha's not a god. He can't kind of bestow enlightenment on you. It's tempting, isn't it, when we sort of look at... I was a Christian when I was in my teens, and I think I sort of have quite an eternalistic view of the way of looking at the world. And I think it's important that we realize that the Buddha isn't a god, he's an exemplar. He's saying that the wonders of the mind are possible, but he can't do that for you. Bhante talks about Buddhism as being a DIY religion, which I quite like. It's basically like you need to make the effort. Actually, in reality, it's like we all need to make the effort together. We all need to make the effort as a community. That's something I really love about being part of a spiritual community is actually this is something we all need to do together, but you need to make an individual effort as well. It's not something anyone else can do for you. But just to conclude, I was thinking about this earlier, and I was talking to a friend about this at the weekend, and so my big love in life is music and the arts, and I was just talking to Tom earlier actually about there's a duo that I really really love. So I make electronic music and I compose, and maybe about 20 years ago I started doing a master's in music composition, and around about the same time I met somebody who's become a very good friend of mine, who's an artist who I really look up to, and he's part of a duo called Soviet France, who I'm sure none of you will have heard of. They're a bit obscure. They've got 5 people that are into them. Actually, they are quite popular, but in a very sort of fringy kind of way. But anyway, when I first heard their music, it was like, what was amazing about it for me was it was like, oh, you can do that. It was like, I don't know if that makes sense to people, but it's like, it's weird because you can do anything, but you need someone to show you that you can do anything. Does that make sense? It's a bit like, there's the legendary story about the Sex Pistols' first gig, which was the Free Trade Hall in Manchester. And it was like 30 people were in the audience. Everybody claims to have been there, so it's like it probably should have been thousands of people there, but there's only about 30 people there. But everyone formed a band afterwards. And everybody said, I didn't know that was possible until I saw them doing that. And that's how I felt when I heard this duo. It was like, I thought I was into quite out there music at the time, but what they were doing was like radically different. Like just these very, very long form pieces of music. They were about an hour long that didn't really sort of do anything. It was just this slowly evolving kind of soundscapes. And yeah, that was my response, was like, oh, I didn't realize you could do that. And in theory, there's no reason why I wouldn't have thought of doing that, but it's like you need somebody else to show you. And it's like, now this is a metaphor, so don't take this too literally, but it's like the Buddha is the supreme artist, and he's saying, no, you can do this. Like, your mind can be like way beyond what you can imagine. And I'm telling you what that's like. And it's incredible. It's beautiful. You don't need to live the way that you're living. You are suffering, and you're suffering needlessly. You don't need to do that. And your mind is because you have this kind of awareness, you can shape your mind. And that's a form of creativity. That's why I love Bhante writing this essay and calling it mind reactive and creative, because as an artist, I think, creativity is a really important value for me. But the most wonderful thing we can be creative with is our mind. Like, we can shape our mind. We can make it into something different. And that includes our heart. It's not like a head thing. We have this word chitta in Buddhism that means heart mind. We can shape our heart mind. We can move it in certain ways. We can let it become something else to the point where it becomes something completely different. And at that point, well, even before that, we start to have a very different effect on the world. We bring beauty, we bring joy, we bring happiness into our own lives and other people's lives through this sort of creative process. And the Buddha is saying, yeah, you can do that. You don't have to live in the way that you're living. You can let go of that. But we need somebody to point that out for us. It's like this thing I was saying. It's if we didn't know that was possible, we wouldn't necessarily, we would need someone to tell us that. And that's what the Buddha is telling us, is that you can do that. You can do something differently. And I'm the exemplar of that, basically. I'm living proof that is possible. And it's possible because it's the potential that exists in all human minds. There's nothing special about the Buddha in that sense. There's nobody in this room that can't move towards towards enlightenment, towards what the Buddha had. And it's really important that we understand that. Like, that means you. It's not an abstract teaching. It means you. It means each of us. It means me, and it means you. It doesn't mean someone else. When I first came along to a Tri Ratna Center, that's basically what I thought. Was like, I'm sure I can be a little bit clearer and a little bit calmer, maybe. But I'm not really going to I'm not really going to change significantly. Not like those people that are really experienced. Not like those people that listen to Wagner. And, not like those people that are like really Buddhisty. Like, that's not me. I'm not that sort of person. But you are that sort of person. You're a person, which means that you are that sort of person. You have that potential. So I don't think we can really answer that question of who is the Buddha, because really, to answer that question, you would need to be a Buddha. To really fully understand what it is to be a Buddha, you'd actually need to have that kind of consciousness. But I think in stepping closer towards the Buddha, we can start to answer that question. And hopefully I've started to answer that question a little bit this evening. And to finish, I just want to read you a little bit from what Bhante says at the end of the chapter, because I think it's really lovely. And it kind of chimes with what I was saying. So this thing about us realizing the significance of the mind that we have and realizing our potential, and it is our potential. For among the life forms in the universe, from the amoeba to the highest realms of the gods, it is only the kind of sentient life to which human beings conform that can be, in the words of Lama Govinda, the vehicle for the rediscovery of the transcendental and inconceivable nature of mind or consciousness. So that's a bit technical, but the final sentence is also sums it up really beautifully. So I'll just read that last sentence again. For among the life forms in the universe, from the amoeba to the highest realms of the gods, it is only the kind of sentient life to which human beings conform that can be, in the words of Lama Govinda, the vehicle for the rediscovery of the transcendental and inconceivable nature of mind or consciousness, that can become, in short, a Buddha. That can become, in short, a Buddha. Okay, great. So I'll end there for this evening. Have a good week, everyone, and hopefully see some of you next week where we'll be carrying on our series on who is the Buddha. And in coming weeks, we'll be looking, a little bit more at the life story of the Buddha and, his teaching, and sort of unpacking this question much more of who is the Buddha. Okay? Take care, everyone. Say again?
Next Monday.
Next Monday, yeah. Same time next Monday, yeah.